Well, cosmological arguments are arguments for the conclusion that God is the ultimate cause, ground, or explanation of the universe, or all of contingent or dependent reality. And there's no better argument to start with than Aquinas' first way, the argument from the unmoved mover. So we have Aquinas' first way. Premise 1, some things are moved. 2, whatever is moved by another. 3, there cannot be an infinite series of movers, and so the conclusion is there must be an unmoved mover. And Aquinas' stock phrase was, and this is what all men mean by God. Now, important for understanding this argument and other arguments which reject an infinite series is the distinction between a series ordered per se and a series ordered per accidens. Okay, so let me illustrate the difference. A series ordered per se would be like this. Here's an example. This is the example Thomas gives, Thomas Aquinas. A hand moves a stick, which moves a stone. Another example would be dominoes. You flick one domino, and it starts this chain reaction where all the dominoes fall. Another example would be Rube Goldberg machines. Have you seen the Rube Goldberg machines? Where
yeah, of course,
it's this insanely complicated device where one thing just sets off this chain reaction that ends in all these interesting series of things happening. Yeah, and then there's the famous example of the turtles all the way down that you might recall. Legend has it that it was either Bertrand Russell or Max Planck were giving a lecture on the theory of gravity and how that explains why the Earth doesn't just fall in empty space. And an impatient old lady in the audience balks at the idea that the Earth could just be floating there in space. And then Russell or Max Planck asks the lady, says, well, what is the Earth resting on then? And then she says, well, it's resting on the shell of a big turtle. And he says, well, what is that turtle resting on? And she says, another turtle. And he says, well, what's that one resting on? And she says, well, it's turtles all the way down. So that's, again, a classic example of a series ordered per se. Now, the problem with that is that it seems to just push explanation back indefinitely. You don't really get an explanation for why anything in the series is happening if it just goes on indefinitely. Now, contrast that with a series ordered per accidens. So examples here would be one person begetting another, and then that person begets another. Another would be, actually, my favorite example would be, have you seen the movie Pay It Forward?
No, I haven't.
Well, the idea there is you do one act of kindness to someone, and then that will inspire them to do an act of kindness to someone else. And in the movie, this young boy's simple act of kindness winds up going viral and triggers this global chain reaction of acts of kindness. That would be a good example of a series ordered per accidens. Now, each member in a series ordered per accidens, it doesn't have to pass on what it received, right? The series could just stop with one person, right? Each member plays an active role to continue the series. They're not automatically passing along what they received in the way that members in a series ordered per se do. In a series ordered per se, each member plays a passive role, automatically passing along something that they got from an original source. So I know that's a bit much for the first argument, but when other arguments reject the possibility of an infinite series, most of them are going to be rejecting the possibility of an infinite series ordered per se, but not per accidens, if that makes sense.
All right. Should we move on to the resources for this one?
Sure. I give a few resources on this distinction between these two kinds of regresses. So Patterson Brown's paper there is very influential, and Caleb Cahoe has some good stuff written on this recently.
All right, let's move on to argument number 2. Aquinas' second way.
Second way for the existence of an uncaused cause. Some things are caused. Whatever is caused by another. There cannot be an infinite series of causes. Again, that's a series ordered per se. So there must be an uncaused cause. Pretty straightforward.
Okay. Should we, do you want to say anything else about that one, or should we move on?
Let's just move on.
Okay. I like that. All right. Aquinas' third way. Why don't I read this one, because there's a lot to read here.
Yeah,
and actually, let me take this off the screen so that people can see all of the text here. All right. So premise number 1, whatever is contingent at one time did not exist. If everything is contingent, then at one time nothing existed. If at one time nothing existed, then nothing would exist now. Something does exist now. So not every being is contingent. So there is a necessary being. Premise 7, either the necessary being gets its necessity from another or exists necessarily of itself. Premise 8, there cannot be an infinite regress of necessary beings that get their necessity from another. And then the conclusion, so there is a necessary being that exists necessarily of itself.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but there you have it. Most of those premises, I think, are pretty straightforward.
Right. Where can people go to find out more about Aquinas' 5 ways? Like, what's a good resource for that?
You know, I struggled with this. I didn't really come up with a good source. Anthony Kinney has a good book on Aquinas' 5 ways.
I mean, you mentioned Ed Feser here. Ed Feser is really good.
You know, I mean, if you're looking for a defense of Aquinas on anything, Feser's pretty much just as good of a source as any other. Is it Antoinette Gilson? He's pretty darn good on the 5 ways. There are actually philosophers who are starting to defend versions of the 5 ways that don't appeal to some of the more Aristotelian concepts that Aquinas assumes. One of them being one of my advisors, PhD advisor, Scott McDonald. I think he's got a paper called Aquinas' Parasitic Cosmological Argument, where it's an extended defense of the first way, using contemporary physics. So you can find defenses. I just didn't put a lot of research into that.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to all right. Argument number 4, Samuel Clarke. And I haven't heard of this one, so I'm really curious. Like, just I guess I'll let you read this one, and then
sure.
I may ask a question or two about it.
So an important distinction for this argument is the distinction between contingent things and dependent things. You might have noticed in the previous argument, it started out arguing that there cannot be an infinite number of contingent things. And then it also went to, there can't be an infinite number of dependent things either. So this distinction is very important. Everything that's contingent is dependent, but not everything that's dependent is contingent.
I like that.
So this argument says we don't even need to talk about contingent things. All we need to do is focus on dependent things, and the argument's off and running.
Yeah, see, this actually strikes me as like, just if we can pause for a second, this argument, what it looks like, the dependence version of like cosmological arguments or contingency arguments, I was really not introduced to these until I started to interact with the work of Josh Rasmussen, which we'll get to. I mean, there's 150 arguments. We're going to get to some Rasmussen and Pruss and everyone else. But he was the first one that I kind of saw this distinction between, in everyday language, when someone hears the word contingent, they're probably thinking of it in the dependence like way, you know what I mean? So it was cool to see him make that distinction and then go on to make an argument for God's existence from dependence. So I just wanted to throw that little anecdote in there. Well, let's get back to the argument and run through all of the premises here.
Okay, so there are dependent beings. For any dependent being, it either depends on itself or it depends on another. Nothing can depend on itself. So all dependent things depend on another. The series of dependent beings which depend on another can't be infinite. If the series of beings which depend on another can't be infinite, then the series of beings which depend on another must ultimately depend on an independent being. So the series of beings which depend on another must ultimately depend on an independent being.
See, I like that. I mean, the premises, I think, are a little bit like the version that I've grown to be familiar with from Rasmussen is a lot more simple. And I think it doesn't like this has some extra steps that I don't think are necessary, but I still like it. I like these arguments from dependence to an independent being.
So, I do too, so I like and they're structurally similar to other cosmological arguments. But yeah, if you stick with the notion of dependence, yeah, I think that's pretty intuitive.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to some resources for this one.
Okay, we have Clarke's classic demonstration, William Rowe, Richard Gale, and Bruce Reichenbach.
There you go. Yeah. Oh, I was going to say that if you guys, so we're going to run through some of these really quickly. So if you, when you see these resources, these resource slides, pause the video and then like jot down whatever you want, because I can't like put everything in the description of this video, all the different resources, because there's actually a limited amount of space. But what I can do is make this Google slide presentation. I can make that available. So I will have that linked in the description after this video is completed. That way you can gain them that way. Or like I said, you can just pause it and do it that way. All right, let's move on to argument number 5. We're only 5 in. Can you believe? And we're already like hitting some really heavy philosophy here. Like I said, these are not like, this is not your brother's argument that he like came up when he was 5 years old and was trying to share it with his other friend when they were just randomly debating God's existence. So these are very, very serious arguments, as you can see. I also like that, like, I mean, because some of these arguments, like, they weren't in this form, right? They weren't like deductive and like a syllogism like this, or like a structured, deductive form. So you had to do a lot of that work yourself. So this is actually this is a huge resource.
Process.
This is a huge resource. Okay. All right. Let's, so just, why don't I read this one? Because you read the last one. All right. So here it is. Leibniz's cosmological argument. CA just means cosmological argument. We're going to have to use some abbreviations here. All right. Premise number 1, anything that exists has a sufficient reason for why it exists, either in another contingent being or in a necessary being. Number 2, the world exists. 3, therefore, the world has a sufficient reason for why it exists, either in another contingent being or in a necessary being. But the sufficient reason for why the world exists cannot be in another contingent being, since A, the world just is the collection of all contingent beings, and B, the sufficient reason for the collection cannot be in its parts, individually or collectively. So, a sufficient reason for the world must be a necessary being outside the world. And the conclusion, therefore, there is a necessary being outside the world.
So the main premise here is going to be premise 4. And this was David Hume's objection to the argument. He thought that this argument, premise 4 in particular, committed the fallacy of composition. If each part is contingent, why should we think that the whole is contingent? So, for example, if he thought it committed the fallacy like this, if each part of an engine weighs, I don't know, a pound, that doesn't follow that the engine weighs a pound. The engine is going to be a lot heavier than just a pound. But now compare a different example. If each part of the wall, each brick of the wall is red, it does follow that the wall is red. So the question is contingency like color, or is it more like weight? And, well, I think it's more like color, right? It's not like weight. A bunch of contingent things together don't add up their contingency to be like more contingency in the same way that something lightweight things don't add up their weight to be more heavy, right? You don't get something that's more contingent just by adding up contingent things. So another way of objecting would be, if each part has an explanation, why think the whole must have an explanation? And here are a few examples to think that just if we've explained each part, that's not sufficient for explaining the whole. Richard Gale has this charming example. I'm modifying a little bit. Imagine that there are 5 philosophers on a particular street corner in New York City, and we want to know why there are 5 philosophers on this particular street corner in New York City. Well, one of them is there because his grandma lives around the block and he's going to see her. One is there because he's on the way to see a play. One is there because he just wanted to get outside and get some fresh air. One is there, because, and so on. So they each have their own individual reason for being on that street corner. That by itself doesn't explain why there are 5 philosophers on this street corner. That seems to cry out for more explanation. And the explanation there would be, oh, there's a meeting of the American Philosophical Association happening in New York City on this weekend. You see how that works?
So there's something a little bit deeper. Yeah, there's got to be some extra explanation for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Alexander Pruss gives a different example. He asks us to imagine a cannonball at rest at noon and then is fired. So we can ask, why is the cannonball moving 1 minute past noon? Well, because it was moving a half a minute past noon. But if that's true, then why was it moving a half a minute past noon? Well, because it was moving a quarter minute past noon. Why was it moving a quarter minute past noon? Well, because it was moving an eighth minute past noon. So why is it moving at any time past noon is the question. So even if its movement at any one time is explained by a prior time, it doesn't explain why the cannonball is moving at all. We need to eventually recourse to the fact that it was fired. So those are 2 examples of how, even if we have an explanation of a part, that doesn't necessarily mean we have an explanation of the whole.
Okay, let's move on to some resources for this one. There we go. Or no, this is the next argument. Okay.
Yeah, so we have a Leibnizian cosmological argument that's defended by Stephen Davis and Bill Craig, which probably is familiar with your viewers. Everything that exists has an explanation. The universe exists, so the universe has an explanation. If the universe has an explanation, it's God, so God exists. The key premise there is 4, which he points out is logically equivalent to what the atheist has always maintained, which is that if God does not exist, the universe has no explanation. It's just brute. So it's a pretty strong argument.
Okay, and let's move on to some resources for that one. Stephen T. Davis, The Cosmological Argument and the Epistemic Status of Belief in God. And William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith. Yeah, he's defended that one in a lot of his works. He's defended that one. Yeah. So, all right, moving on. So now we are on to argument number 7. Pruss, the Leibnizian argument from Alexander Pruss. And I'll read this one because I just have such an affinity for Alexander Pruss. All right, number 1 is every contingent fact has an explanation. Number 2, there is a contingent fact that includes all other contingent facts. Number 3, therefore, there is an explanation of this fact. 4, this explanation cannot itself be a contingent fact. And then the conclusion, so the explanation of all contingent facts is necessary. What's like the number 1 objection to this argument?
It's that the first premise is false. And the first premise is what's called the strong principle of sufficient reason. So they're just going to want to deny that every contingent fact has an explanation. There are brute facts.
Okay, and some resources for this one, the Leibnizian cosmological argument in Craig and Moreland's The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which I've got sitting on my shelf back here. This one is also actually available on Pruss's website, I believe. So if you just search for the title of this, then it'll pull up and you can you can read it for free if you want to learn more about his argument. And Pruss, just like, you need to know who he is. If you don't, you need to look him up. You need to look at what the sorts of things that he's saying. I've even featured a couple of his talks on this YouTube channel that you can go and watch. One of them was on the argument from beauty, and another one was a sort of newish argument for God's existence from paradoxes, like the Grim Reaper paradox that I discuss, or that I've had other philosophers on to talk about. All right. Argument number 8, the GALE-PRUSS.
So you asked what the strongest objection to the previous argument was, and it's what's called the strong principle of sufficient reason. Well, Alexander Pruss and Richard Gale tried to come up with an argument based on a weak principle of sufficient reason, which is premise 1 here. For any proposition P, if P is true, then possibly there is a proposition Q that explains P. So it's a little bit weaker than that strong principle of sufficient reason we encountered before. Premise 2, all contingently true propositions in the actual world form a big conjunctive proposition. They use the term fact, but just for consistency, I'll just use proposition, BCCP, big conjunctive contingent proposition. Possibly, this is premise 3, possibly there's a proposition Q that explains BCCP. 4, Q explains BCCP only if Q involves a necessary being. And this is because if Q were wholly contingent, Q would be in BCCP. So Q can't be contingent, but necessary. Premise 5, there is a proposition Q that explains BCCP that involves a necessary being. And this follows from 3 and 4, and it's provable in S5, modal system S5, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the argument is this. Look, if possibly Q explains P and Q explains P only if Q is necessary, then possibly Q is necessary. In other words, if Q is possibly necessary, but if Q is possibly necessary, it follows in modal system S5 that it is necessary. So Q. Then we're on premise 6. Q explains BCCP only if Q reports a personal explanation. And the reason here is that there's a distinction between personal explanations and scientific explanations. Scientific explanations are explanations in terms of the laws of nature, law-like generalities. Personal explanations are explanations in terms of agents and their intentions. So if we ask a question, why is the water boiling? You could give a scientific explanation in terms of the mean kinetic energy, the water molecules, blah, blah, blah. Or you could give a personal explanation, which is that I wanted to make some tea. So we have this distinction between these two kinds of explanation. Well, they point out, Gale and Pruss point out that because scientific explanations are just generalizations over all of contingent reality, scientific explanations must also be contingent. So scientific explanations can't involve only contingent propositions, all of which are already included in BCCP. So no scientific explanation, no proposition reporting a scientific explanation can explain BCCP. So whatever proposition explains BCCP, and this is the conclusion, it must, well, it's, premise 6, must report a personal explanation. And so the conclusion, there's a proposition Q that explains BCCP that involves a necessary being and reports a personal explanation.
Yeah, so this one, someone's noting in the comment section that this one is a little bit more on the complex side, which is okay. We're going to get even into more complex waters, a whole lot more complex when we start talking about ontological arguments, which is section number 2. So if that was too much, then just get ready because it's about to get a lot worse. Yeah. So there's that. But then I was going to say something that's... Let me say this first. So my favorite, not my favorite, but a really cool thing about this argument, let me pull it back up here, is that Gale is an atheist. Mm-hmm. He's I don't know if he's agnostic technically, but he's definitely not a theist. He's a non-theist. Yet, I just want you to note that he's developed this argument for God's existence with Alexander Pruss, and he's defended it in the literature and everything. Like that to me, it shows a big difference between what happens in the philosophy world, like the academic world, as opposed to what happens on YouTube and in debates on Facebook and on Twitter and stuff. It's like in the philosophy world and the academic world, they're not afraid to steel man arguments, to attempt to better the other side's position. And so it's just, I don't know, I find that really, really interesting. That Gale, he's a non-theist himself, yet he's defended this argument and developed the dialectic that way. I just think that's really cool. I think
Gale's work is very underappreciated. It's brilliant, and his writing is superb. I love Gale's writing. You should, if you haven't read much Richard Gale, you should. But the point I wanted to make earlier is that the more complicated arguments are going to be in these first few categories, cosmological and ontological. It gets easier from there.
Good to note. All right, so let's move on to some resources for this one, which is just Richard Gale and Alexander Pruss's A New Cosmological Argument, and that you can find in Religious Studies. Okay, moving on to cosmological argument, and this is argument number 9. So I'll go ahead and read this one. This one's got a lot on the screen here. PPE, and is that just a principle? What is PPE stand
Let me
for?
take this one, because I've got my notes on this one. It's a little bit, it might not be transparent.
Okay,
so two philosophers, Katz and Kramer, they think that you can run a cosmological argument without the principle of sufficient reason, based on this principle. And it's the principle of epistemic explanations, they call it. Okay, so kind of a mouthful there. And it's PPE. Given that 1, there's a possible explanation of the fact that F, and 2, any possible explanation of the fact that F entails P, it's reasonable to believe P. Here's an example. The match is on fire. Any possible explanation of that fact entails that there's oxygen in the atmosphere. So it's reasonable to believe that there's oxygen in the atmosphere. Okay? So we can run the argument with PPE. 1, the proposition that there's a unique necessary being who brought about the existence of everything other than itself by willing that the other being should exist would, if true, explain why there are contingent beings. There is a possible explanation of the fact that there are contingent beings. And so 1 and 2, premise 3 here, there is no proposition consistent with the claim that there are only contingent beings, which, if true, would explain why there are contingent beings. Well, 1 and 2 together satisfy PPE. That's the principle. Given that 1, there is a possible explanation of the fact that there are contingent beings, and 2, any possible explanation of that fact, of the fact that there are contingent beings, entails P, there is a necessary being, it's reasonable to believe that P, there is a necessary being. So 1 and 2 together just satisfies the main principle here. And we had premise 3 and then premise 4. Any possible explanation of the fact that there are contingent beings entails that there is a necessary being. And so the conclusion, it's reasonable to believe that there is a necessary being.
Okay, I'm not going to add a whole lot on this one other than to say maybe we should move on to give some resources on this one. Do you want to talk about that resource at all, or should we just move on?
Let's just move on.
Okay. Easy enough.
Okay.
Yeah, you're going to have to take this one too.
Yeah. This is, okay, KOON'S cosmological argument, published in 1997, was instrumental in launching a lot of different cosmological arguments. Very influential cosmological argument, and it's extremely logically tight, okay? So it's based on certain mereological axioms, a few principles of causation, and then the argument's off and running. It's similar to the Leibnizian cosmological argument, except with cause, but not explanation. Okay, so here are the mereological axioms. Mereological just being the study of parts and wholes. So axiom 1, X is a part of Y if and only if anything that overlaps X overlaps Y. Overlaps just means they share a part in common. Axiom 2, if there's a thing of type C, then there is an aggregate or sum of all such types. 3, X is identical to Y if and only if X is a part of Y and Y is a part of X. 4, if a whole exists, so do all of its parts. And 5, if all the parts of a whole exist, so does the whole. Now, these axioms of mereology are not very controversial, so he's just kind of taking them for granted. Now, here's a definition. A wholly contingent thing is something that has no necessary parts. It's entirely contingent, nothing necessary about it. Okay, 3 principles of causation. First,
is that the next slide?
Yeah, next slide. First, only actual existent things can be causes or effects. Seems pretty reasonable. Second, a cause and its effect must be distinct. The cause can't overlap its effect. And then third, every wholly contingent thing has a cause. Now, the argument runs as follows. Next slide. All parts of a necessary thing are necessary. That follows from axiom 4. And K is just system modal logic. In modal logic, every contingent thing has a wholly contingent part. The first and second axioms. Definition, let C be the aggregate of all wholly contingent reality. 3, if there are any contingent things, C is wholly contingent thing. That follows from A1, A3, the definition, and lemma 1. Lemma 4, if there are any contingent things, C has a cause, follows from lemmas 3 and the C3, which I think is just the C3, the third principles of causation. Every contingent thing overlaps C. And then we can derive from these theorem. If there are any contingent things, then the cosmos, the sum of all wholly contingent things, has a cause that is a necessary thing. Now, I said it's a very tight argument, and you can see how tight it is if you just look at my own simplification here in the next slide. Premise 1, there are contingent things. 2, the cosmos is the sum of all wholly contingent things. Now he's just defining the cosmos in that way. 3, the sum of all wholly contingent things is a wholly contingent thing. That's what most of what we just covered went to establish, and that is a derived. That's not really a premise. That's derived from the axioms and definitions. 4, so the cosmos is a wholly contingent thing. 5, each wholly contingent thing has a cause. That's the key premise of the argument. And then 6, so the cosmos has a cause that is not a contingent thing. It's namely a necessary thing. Now, what's cool about this argument is if you accept the axioms and you accept those three principles of causation, it all follows. The conclusion follows. The only premise in this argument, other than the fact that there are contingent things, which isn't, I mean, that's a pretty safe assumption. The only premise of this argument is 5. Each wholly contingent thing has a cause. And he defends 5 by saying that he just appeals to empirical science. He says every success of common sense in science is by reconstructing causal antecedents of things that we observe in nature. So everything that we see that's contingent is a cause. So that's really the main premise there. And this is a good example of how these outlines are just the tip of an iceberg of material that you can get into.
To put it lightly, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here is some resources here for the. Okay, so I said that I wasn't going to do like anything to kind of break up the monotony, but after that one, I've got to. So we are on. That was 10 arguments. I'm going to do 10 push-ups. We're going to see how this goes. You can join me if you want. You don't have to, but and unfortunately, people aren't going to be able to see me do these. So I don't know. We'll just see how it goes. I'm just going to do it. Here I go. 1, 2, 3, 4. I feel like Michael Scott. I did it.
Yeah. Very good.
All right. 10 push-ups. 10 arguments, 10 push-ups.
I'll take a drink of some apple juice.
There you go. You're telling people it's apple juice, but we both know what it really is. Just kidding. Yeah, I mean, we may need to get a beer after this anyways. This is intense.
We're in intermission.
All right.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Like I said, they get easier. That's one of the more complicated ones that we'll go over.
Okay. Well, I at least I appreciated your simplified version, so that was cool. All right, here we go. Here is argument number 11. Should I read this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, here we go. For any, let me read the title of this one. So this one is from Pruss and Rasmussen's book. I think this is their book, Necessary Existence. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm still catching my breath. I shouldn't be this out of shape. All right, premise 1. For any particular contingent concrete, something that possibly causes things, there is an explanation of the fact that those things exist. Number 2, considering all the contingent concrete things that exist, if there is an explanation of the fact that those things exist, then there is a necessary concrete thing. And then conclusion just follows. So there is a necessary concrete thing. There you go.
Yeah, and for defense of that, see their book, Necessary Existence. Fantastic book.
There you go. It's so good. It's very complex, and it's difficult at points, which you probably would expect from those two authors writing a book together. But all right, so here we go. Let's move on. Cosmological argument, and this is our argument number 12. I'll let you take this one.
So this is Emmanuel Rutten's atomistic cosmological argument. Premise 1, there are objects.
Never heard of him or this argument, so I'm really excited.
He comes up again later, so yeah, we'll encounter him again. 2, every composite object is ultimately composed of simple objects. 3, every object is caused or is the cause of another object. The sum of all caused simple objects is an object. The cause of an object is disjoint, which means they don't share a part in common with that object. Every caused composite object contains a caused proper part. That's the key premise. 7, there is a first cause. You can find his dissertation online by searching Emmanuel. Well, the title of his dissertation is The Resource. In the next slide, he goes through a handful of cosmological arguments, and that's the one he thinks is most defensible.
So I'm getting a little concerned, Chad, because we're only 12 arguments in and we're already at an hour. At this rate, we're not going to be done until tomorrow. So maybe we should speed it up a little bit.
Okay.
So here's an argument that everyone should be familiar with at this point if you're watching this and interested in these types of things. KALAM cosmological argument: whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. So the conclusion, the universe has a cause. And this one is defended famously by William Lane Craig in the KALAM cosmological argument. He's also got some papers on this. You can check his website. It looks like, well, why don't you mention the rest of these, because you put this together. It's interesting that you've mentioned Callum Miller's paper here, actually, that I'm looking at this.
Yeah, I was going to include that as a separate outline, but time got away from me. The basic idea there is just that if theism is true, it's much more likely that the universe began to exist than if naturalism were true, which is confirmatory evidence for theism.
Dang, you definitely should have put that as a separate argument. It's your fault.
I know.
You screwed it up. You screwed it up, Chad. All right, let's move on.
Yeah. So here's Alexander Pruss's KALAM, which is 1, something has a cause. 2, there are no causal loops, nothing causes itself. 3, nothing has an infinite causal history, and that's the burden of his book. What's the title of it? You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, I think.
There it is. So there is an uncaused cause. That follows directly from 1, 2, and 3. 5, if there's an uncaused cause, God exists. 6, so God exists.
There you go. And that one, like you said, is defended in Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, 2018. It's an amazing book. All right, so this one, Swinburne's inductive cosmological argument. I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so Swinburne famously makes a distinction between 2 different kinds of inductive arguments, good inductive arguments. The first is what he calls a p-inductive argument. And that's just when a piece of evidence makes a hypothesis more likely true than not. So it pushes the likelihood of the hypothesis over half, basically. It makes it more likely true than not. Now, by contrast, there are C-inductive arguments, which are arguments where some piece of evidence just makes the hypothesis more likely. Not more likely than not. It just increases the probability of the hypothesis a little bit. Okay, so that's how he frames his cosmological argument. He thinks the universe makes for a good C-inductive cosmological argument. So 1, the universe exists and is a certain way, namely, it's complex, yet everything behaves in an orderly, law-like way. It is such as to be suitable, a suitable theater for humans and animals to evolve. Humans did evolve so as to be able to have true beliefs about the world and to meaningfully act within it. Okay, so if theism can explain why the universe exists and is this way better than naturalism can, then the universe exists and is this way makes theism more likely than naturalism. Well, theism can explain why the universe exists in this way better than naturalism can. So the universe exists and is this way makes theism more likely than naturalism. Now, the main premise here is going to be 2. Why think naturalism can't explain why the universe exists and is this way better than theism? Well, again, he draws on this distinction between personal explanations and scientific explanations. Naturalism only has scientific explanations available to it. It doesn't have personal explanations available to it. So
at a cosmological level.
Yeah, at the cosmological level. Yeah, good point. So the only thing that could explain the universe at the cosmological level is a personal explanation. So that's why theism is more probable. The universe makes theism more probable than naturalism.
Okay, let's move on.
Yeah,
I'm gonna start being a little bit more strict on that. So we'll go as quick. We'll go through these a little bit quicker now. All right. So a SCOTUS modal cosmological argument. That should be fun. Go ahead.
Whatever cannot possibly exist from something else possibly exists from itself. It's possible that a first causal potency exists. Now, by first causal potency, he means a first cause, but not necessarily one that exercises its causal power. Okay. The first causal potency cannot possibly exist from something else. So it's possible that a first causal potency exists from itself. What is non-existent cannot bring anything into existence. Even if, per impossible, what is non-existent could bring something else into existence, could bring itself into existence, it would not be altogether uncausable. So it's not possible for something to exist from itself, which does not actually exist from itself. So a first causal potency does exist from itself.
Nice. I'm not going to add a whole lot more on that other than, well, I mean, this is why I love the fact that we're doing all of these resources, is that people can go and search. If you want to look more into these arguments, you can do that. So this one, when did SCOTUS live actually? Because he's one of these like Aquinas characters in the Middle Ages. Is that right?
Following Aquinas, a 12th century, I believe, maybe 13th, 12th or 13th.
Yeah, so he's a little bit on the older side in terms of like distance from us. And it was also defended by Timothy O'Connor, which he's also a really good philosopher that people should be aware of, Timothy O'Connor. Mm-hmm. So there you go. All right, that one is SCOTUS's modal cosmological argument. What number are we on? We're on number 17. I'm going to see my goal, as I just made this goal up, is that every 10 arguments or so, I'm going to see if I can just do 10 push-ups every 10 arguments. Okay. And then when I like completely run out of steam, it's just that's what happens.
Yeah, all right, bear in mind too, I guess it deserves repeating that these first two categories are the most technical and complex. It gets easier, just as a reminder.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a lot of really cool stuff that you've probably never heard of or ever seen. So all of it is worth. I mean, people who are watching this, this is just my hunch, my guess. People who are watching this are just eating all of this stuff up. This is all like,
I hope so.
Yeah, this. I mean, even for me, and I'm sitting here doing it with you. Like this is just. I live for this kind of stuff. So James Ross's, this is another one I haven't heard of, modal cosmological argument. I feel like I should let you read this one again. You're just covering so much ground that I'm not familiar with.
It is impossible that anything prevent the existence of God. That just is conceptually true.
I agree with that.
God. Yeah. For every individual X, if it is a fact that X exists or a fact that X does not exist, it is possible that there is an explanation for the fact that X exists. For the fact that X exists, that must be a typo, and the fact that X does not exist. That's a version of the PSR. So suppose for reductio that God does not exist. 4, it is possible that there is an explanation for the fact that God does not exist. 5, it is not possible that there is an explanation for the fact that God does not exist. 6, it is and is not possible that there's an explanation for the fact that God does not exist, which is a contradiction. So we reject the premise that we assumed, which is 3, God does not exist, and so it's false that God does not exist.
That one is super confusing to me. I'd have to think about that a lot. Well, this one, James Ross, right? That's the guy so 1969 is when he developed this. Oh, and then we see Richard Gale again. So did he defend this argument in this resource that you've listed?
He's got a critical assessment of it, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, fair enough. All right, let's move on. So argument number 18, Christopher Weaver's modal cosmological argument.
Let's skip this argument because it's virtually identical to Rasmussen and Weaver's argument in the 24 or so volumes. So let's just go ahead and skip forward to that. Which is coming up soon,
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
I outlined Weaver's argument before I read that paper and said, oh, it's basically the same argument. So
I think you actually used the same number here too. So it's 18. We were still in the same argument.
Yeah, so. I didn't count it as a separate argument for that reason.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. It is possible that there's a purely contingent totality event that has a cause. It is impossible. Well, first of all, events are things that contain only contingent things, according to them. So why I think one is true? Well, they give 3 reasons. Follows from a general principle of causality. There's nothing about a totality of purely contingent events that's different from other purely contingent events. It's inductively safe. It's conceivable. Whatever's conceivable is possible. So they give some arguments for 1. Okay, premise 2. It is impossible that a cause of a purely contingent totality event is purely contingent. 3, if 1 and 2, then it's possible that there is a cause that isn't purely contingent. 4, if 3, then there is a necessary thing that can be a cause. And so 5, there is a necessary thing that can be a cause.
All right. And the resource for that one is a very recent book that came out. I've actually, I did a whole thing on it, a whole video on that book, 24 or so arguments for God's existence. And what we decided, Chad, was we just wanted to like completely make that look bad. So we wanted to do a whole series on 150 arguments. So way more than 24. Way more than 24. Sorry,
yeah,
sorry.
24. Well, hold my beer.
Yeah, there was a joke. I think Callum Miller, and you were doing something on Facebook. Anyways, that's completely beside the point. But go read this article. It's also available, I think, on Josh Rasmussen's site, or it may be available on Weaver's. I'm not sure, but you can probably get that one for free if you just search for it. Okay, Pruss and Rasmussen's modal cosmological argument. Let me take this one. I'll read this one. All right, premise 1. For any positive state of affairs that can begin to obtain, it is possible for there to be something external to it that causes it to obtain. Feel free to like add anything that you want, because you've been doing that as you have been listing out the arguments. Number 2, it is possible for there to be a beginning of the positive state of affairs of its being the case that there exist contingent concrete things. Premise 3, if 1 and 2 are true, then it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing. Premise 4, so it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing. 5, it is possible that there is if it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing, then there is a necessary concrete thing. And then the conclusion, so there is a necessary concrete thing.
Yep, and details for that argument are in the same book we mentioned, Necessary Existence. That's chapter 4.
There you go. All right,
okay, Descartes' cosmological argument. This requires a little bit of explanation here because he's got some terminology. So premise 1 is there must be in the cause of an idea at least as much formal reality as the idea contains objective reality. Now, what he means by objective reality is the idea as it is represented in the mind. Now, a formal reality, by contrast, is the object's actual extramental reality. So here's an example. An idea, according to Descartes, is like a painting. The objective reality is the painting itself, whereas the formal reality is what the painting is of in the world, like the landscape, the actual landscape. So the formal reality of the painting is more real than the objective reality of the painting. And the objective reality can never be as great or as perfect as the thing itself. Okay, so 2, I have the idea of God. 3, my idea of God is the effect of some cause. 4, the idea of God has an infinite objective reality. So the idea of God has a cause with infinite formal reality. No finite substance, such as myself, can be the cause of my idea of God. Only an infinite substance can be the cause of my idea of God, so God exists. Now, if you want to simplify it down to bare bones, it would be, I have an idea of a perfect being, God. Ideas, like other things, have causes, some by other ideas, some by extramental realities the ideas are of. 3, my idea of God cannot have been caused by other ideas of my own. And the idea here is that the idea of God is innate in me. I am implicitly aware of God as a perfect being because I am aware of myself as an imperfect being. So the conclusion is, so my idea of God is caused by the extramental reality it is an idea of, namely that which actually possesses perfection, God. Complicated argument, but once you understand the scholastic terminology he uses, it's pretty interesting.
Okay, so a couple things. So first of all, I'm about to do 10 more push-ups. Second thing, I wanted to reiterate to everybody that we're going to do something at the very end of this, which is really important. So if as you're going through and you're hearing some of these arguments, you're like, that's not really a good argument, that's super weak. There's actually some interesting implications that can be drawn if we consider all of these arguments to be weak, which is just stick around until the end for that to happen. Okay, that out of the way, let me do some more push-ups.
Well, before you do your push-ups, we got one more cosmological argument to cover.
Okay, so then I've got to do 11.
It's the most powerful cosmological argument of the whole bunch.
Okay.
You ready? It's the cosmological argument, in fact.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right, there you go.
Premise 1, everything has a cause. 2, if everything has a cause, then the universe has a cause. So the universe has a cause, and it's God. There you go. And for the resources here, you can find this argument defended by no one ever